This is Antic, the Atari 8-Bit podcast. I am Kevin Savitz. Michael Boucher was a programmer at MECC, the Minnesota Educational Computing Consortium, from September 1980 through August 1984, where he worked on educational software for the Apple II and Atari 8-Bit computers. His projects included Oregon Trail and Odell Lake. This interview took place on June 14, 2016.
So I lived in St. Paul, Minnesota. And at that time, the St. Paul public school systems had a system in which they tried to make sure that each of the schools, especially the high schools, had an area of expertise at which they really excelled. So Central High School was the arts school. They had a poet in residence and fantastic stage gear and so forth, and the rest of the district shared a box of crayons. My school was Highland Park. And one of our areas of concentration was computers. And so we had access to the school, or access to a statewide mainframe run by the Minnesota Educational Computing Consortium, MECC, called MECC. And so I did a lot of that in high school. But where I got started in computers was between 6th and 7th grade. There was a program, the Twin City Institute for Talented Youth, and that also had various concentrations. You could concentrate in math or what have you. Computer science was one of them. And so I applied to that and got accepted. And so at the ripe old age of however old sixth graders are, I went into computer software, started doing computers. And it was love at first sight. And so then continued that through junior high school. And then in high school, MECC ran a computer programming contest. And so I submitted a program for there. Won first place when I was 14 with a program to keep track of your paper route. And it was an awful program, but apparently everybody else was worse. One of the options, for example, was that you could sort your paper route by address. But what that meant is that the addresses all came out in numerical order, and so the odds and evens were, of course, interleaved. And so if you followed the route, you would have to run across the street after delivering to each house. So that was terrible.
What system did this run on?
This ran on our Cyber. It was the statewide mainframe, so it ran on a Cyber 6600,
Sure.
Which was a control data machine.
Which is a machine that most kids who had a newspaper route would have access to.
I assume so. I presume everybody had an enormous mainframe in their house with a raised floor and the whole thing. Sure. And the prize for winning was lunch with the regional computer coordinator. And so I went and made my pitch. You need to hire me. And she said, you need to be 16. I didn't manage to be 16, so I didn't get it. So next year I entered the programming contest again and had a football game called Footy Ball for no particular reason other than there weren't enough characters in the file names allowed to call it something better. So I called it that, won again, got lunch again, made my pitch again, wasn't 16 again. And so back to the drawing board. And then when I turned 16, then of course I called immediately, and they had filled all of their slots and weren't hiring again until the next year. But I called every month, at the first of the month, called Linda Borey, who was our coordinator. And finally, in an act of desperation, she circulated my resume, and I got hired. So when I was 16, so whatever grade that is, probably 10th, I started out as a real live computer programmer, and that job was programming on Apple computers, and then later we added Atari computers.
Nice. So this was, I believe, 1980 or so, right? September 1980.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So, all right. So you're there, your first day. What'd they put you to work doing?
They had me start doing some work on the Apple II. They had some program, I don't recall what it was, but it needed a feature added to it. And so I worked on actually a bunch of programs, um, did a lot of really good work, did important stuff, contributed a lot to the development of our nation's educational computing infrastructure, all of which will be lost to history because I also worked on Oregon Trail. And so as soon as I say Oregon Trail, then everybody says, "Oh, well,
I remember Oregon Trail. Right.
yeah, yeah." And I'd just like to take this opportunity to say, I'm sorry about the dysentery. They made us do that. So,
Nice. Um, all right. So before we talk about Oregon Trail, let's talk about the lesser loved things. Lots of, I'm sure there were lots of. I mean, MECC was prolific. They came out with so much other stuff, and a lot of it was, math drills and just all sorts of stuff. So, can you remember some of the other titles that you worked on?
worked on a cell simulator, and that's strangely enough to this day I remember how the cell regulates hydration. It when it pumps sodium out, water comes in, and so if it needs water, it pumps out sodium, and when it needs to get rid of the water, it absorbs sodium. So I don't know if our customers learned that as well as I did, but I did. So anything you want to know about the sodium pump, just ask me, and if it was in that last sentence, I know it.
Nice.
And then there was did a bit on Math Invaders, and that's Space Invaders if you remember that game, except with math problems and things like that. Did a variation on Bank Street Writer. Bank Street Writer was an early word processor, and another company came out with that, and then we did a derivation of that, so I worked on that. And then MECC also, in addition to doing its microcomputer software for the Apple, ran a statewide mainframe network. So in my spare time, I got to play on the mainframe, but I never actually got to do anything that was released, any work on that. Just learned about mainframes is all.
Cool. All right. So, what did you do with Oregon Trail? How were you involved with that? How many people were on that project? I mean, was it 3 or 20?
Let's see here. There were two lead developers, Todd and Mike, and they were actually the leaders of everything. They were our group leaders, and they worked on that the most. And then I got to fix miscellaneous bugs from time to time. And so the incredible acclaim I received for working on Oregon Trail all comes from the reflected glory of Todd and Mike's work. I did miscellaneous things to fix the graphics and make the deer less jumpy and so forth. But it was Todd and Mike were the leads on that.
Nice. Right. So, at what point did they put an Atari computer in front of you?
So then the MECC began to branch out into other types of computers. We used the IBM PC and the PC Junior, and then the Atari. And we started with the Atari 400, which was the sealed keyboard. So the Atari 400 and the 800 had different keyboards, and the 400 had that rubber sealed keyboard that you could pour Coke on, and it wouldn't break. And so for science, we did that, and it actually works. And then we used the 800s for our development because they were bigger and more capable. And the Atari had what are called sprite graphics. And so you could, to work on the Apple II, we had a single graphics buffer, and we would have to draw things on it. And then to animate, we would, by hand, recolor all the pixels and move things around. But the drawback to that is that we would have to keep track of the background and repaint the background and so forth. Atari had support for sprites, which was a graphics character, and you could move the sprites around with X and Y coordinates, and the Atari itself would take care of updating the background and things of that nature. so then we got to do much better graphics on the Atari than on the other machines. And even though the PC had a more capable processor in it, it did not have the dedicated graphics hardware that the Atari had, and so it so the Atari's graphics systems were always superior in many ways.
So do you remember what programs you did for the Atari?
Let's see here. Um, did again a bit on Oregon Trail, and but Odell Lake was another biggie at MECC, and it was an ecosystem simulator where you got to play the part of a fish, and you would have to determine what to do as you swam around the lake, and if you met another fish in your ecosystem, you should attack him and chase him off so he didn't take all your food, otherwise you'd starve. But if you spent your time attacking too many fish that weren't going to take your food, then you would waste energy and you would die. And then whenever you could be tricked into going near the surface, then the osprey would sweep down and take you away. And thus it was you would learn about the food chain and your position in it, which is below the osprey.
Sounds like a happy game. Oh. You're killing people by dysentery and by ospreys eating them, and just,
yeah. It was pretty much. It was kind of like the electronic form of fairy tales. The previous generation had to read about witches taking children and boiling them in Hansel and Gretel, right. And we could actually animate them, so you could see. You could actually see people die. I think that was a major advantage for us.
Absolutely, sure. Yeah, grisly deaths. I like it. All right, so, and the Atari version of Oregon Trail for some reason was in a package called Expeditions that was, I believe, released by Atari. Might have also been by MECC. It was like a package of a bunch of different educational stuff. Do you know anything about that? Do you care?
I will take your word for it.
Okay.
We wrote it, handed it to Marge, and whatever happened next happened next.
Sure. Yeah. All right, what any other projects?
Because at this time I was still a high school student. Yeah, I was still a high school student at this time, and then a college student, such that I was, and so I wasn't really involved in much beyond the programming.
Sure. So you'd go to school all day, and then after school, or was it weekends or a couple hours after school? How did that work?
So through high school, I would go to school and then just take the bus directly from school to MECC, and then I would work there until it was time to go home, and I'd go home, eat, and go to sleep, and that was pretty much the schedule that I kept. And so, if you imagine that there is something missing from that schedule, like say homework, for example. You would be correct. No homework was accomplished, and my grades were of corresponding quality. But then when I got to college, then of course everything changed, and by everything I mean they didn't take attendance, so my grades were even worse. But got to do that, and then they gave us keys to the building so that we could get in because we were students. We kept hours that some of the full-time people did not, so we got keys to the building, and so then we could come in anytime. And so then there was no chance of getting homework done. And so I had the honor of working with the finest group of dropouts I have ever had the pleasure of associating with.
Nice. Nice. All right. Any other projects stick in your mind as interesting or notable while you were there?
There was a project, and I wish I could remember what the project was. All I remember was that we were using I got a chance to actually do some of the graphics design on this project. And so it was that I learned about copyright. Yeah, copyright's an important idea. If for your graphics, you just look at what other people have done and then reproduce it in 8-bit graphics, then you have to have a meeting with Marge, and then you have to go back and do it all again correctly this time. Mm-hmm. So that's what I recall. And then we were using a mixture of, for all of the projects, we were using a mixture of BASIC and assembly language. And then the assembly language came in two forms. The processor on that machine, I believe, was a 6502, but there was also a dedicated graphics chip. And the so we got to program the graphics chip also. And the interesting thing about the graphics chip was that the monitors at the time were CRTs, cathode ray terminals. And so they worked by scanning a line at a time. They'd draw a line, then do what's called a V-blank, which is a brief period of time where the electron gun resets to the left of the screen and then draws the next line and then sends a V-blank and so forth. Well, the system didn't have as many resources as we would like. They had a set of specialized registers to control the sprites and things like that. But we often wanted more than was available in the hardware. And the way that we could make that work was you could actually get notification of the V-blank. And then there was a particular amount of time you had before it would start drawing again. And so you could play with the video settings while that was happening. And so you could reload different values into the sprites. You could even, as I recall, change the resolution or the color sets. And so if there's a set of color registers that you need to draw the sky and the birds and so forth, that was one thing. And then when you got enough V-blanks down to where you weren't in the sky anymore, then you could switch the color palette and make it suitable for the forest or, whatever came next. And so it's a fairly sophisticated bit of code. And happily, nobody told us that it was hard. And being high school students, we didn't have the experience to know it was difficult, so we just did it. Later, as we told other people what we'd done, we found out that we're great. And so that that sort of hubris has stuck with us, I think, to this day. I think if you meet any of the original MECC people now, you'll find out that we are still insufferably arrogant because now we know how great we were.
Sure. Nice. So you were there for 4 years, looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Until August 84. So either tell me more stories or tell me how the time came to an end.
Let's hear. So we, it was all of us had keys to the building, and so we were able to come and go as we pleased, and especially come in on late nights and weekends. And so we made the most of that opportunity. At one point, a developer named Shane McCarran brought in a futon, and so we set aside a room where we could sleep and put the futon in there, and then there were no limits. Then we didn't have to go home anymore because we had the vending machines, programmer food, and we had the place to sleep, and so we could all sign up for our time on the futon and so forth. And so we just went nuts learning about everything that we possibly could. We had access to the machine room where they kept the cyber, the mainframe. We had at that time also the IBM PCs had been added. We had the Ataris and the Apples, and so it was just being a precocious group. We kind of set up a frat, even though most people don't get those until college. But being that we were really advanced, we set up our own little high school frats, and it was wonderful, and we learned a lot. Everybody in that group went on to be really top of his class at whatever he did, except, ironically, given the phrase top of his class, everything except school, at which we were all bottom of our class. All of us have dropped out or been thrown out at one time or another. Some of us went back and made it through. Some of us didn't. But everybody is really excellent at what he does now, and that experience is what drove that, and it was marvelous. At one point, as MECC grew to be the largest educational software house in the world at that time. And after a while, people took an interest in us outside of the company. And so our glorious leader, our president, Ken Broombaugh, would often bring customers through and would give them a tour of the building. And in an act of what I think can only be described as poor judgment on his part, would bring them also through the programmers area. And thus it was that the rule that all programmers have to be out of their bathrobes by 9 a.m. was instituted. And as long as Ken didn't come by before 10:30, as far as he knew, it was observed. And it was everything that that a group of young men and two women could possibly hope for as an experience at that time.
Nice. When you say two women, were there high school girl programmers there too, or are you talking managers and things?
Yeah. Let's see here. One of the programmers' sisters worked there, though she was not a programmer. And then we had a female programmer named Laura Polari. And then Nan Leakley had been a programmer on the mainframe side, and she came over to be our supervisor. And so Nan was a good manager and also, of course, a respected programmer, having come from the mainframe side. But it was mostly the classic programmer culture of the time.
I should probably ask them this, but what do you think they thought about the stinky ruffian high school boy frat culture going on under their, with them?
Nan was results oriented. As long as we produced results and didn't break too much stuff, then what happened in the programmers area stayed in the programmers area, especially, as I mentioned, after 10:30 a.m. Let's see, a lot of our designers, our courseware developers were women, and they were actual real live women. They weren't high school students. They were professional designers. And they tolerated us well. They would give us designs. We would implement them. Not much more interaction than that. And so they were a very talented group, and we respected them for us, and they respected our technical talents, and so we otherwise kind of stayed out of each other's way and got the work done.
Cool. I get the impression you would have done all of this for free, but I'm curious if were they paying you well? Was it minimum wage? What was that like?
It had to be better than minimum wage. Yeah, they were paying us pretty well. In fact, we were all ridiculously overpaid, for high school students, and ridiculously underpaid for programmers. And so they were lucky to find us, and we were lucky to find them. They kept us in Devani's Pizza and movies at the Uptown and gas in our cars, and really, what beyond that did we need?
Sure. Yeah. What'd your parents think of all this? I mean, after they saw a report card or two, when you're never home,
I think that they felt like there were aspects of my life that could have used some work. My scholastic decisions were uniform in nature, that all being poor, of course, and they would have been happier if I had passed a class or two. And then after a while, I shaped up and stopped flunking classes, which is to say I dropped out. And then that solved that failing classes problem pretty effectively, I would say. I didn't fail another class after that for quite a while. And my colleagues were, similarly situated. And but on the other hand, we were doing things that were obviously of some commercial value, and it seemed like there was a possibility we were going to get jobs. And so, what more can a proud parent say?
Cool. So how did your time at MECC come to an end?
Then I got a chance to go to work for Control Data Corporation, Control Data being the supplier of our mainframe. And so I seized it and went to work for Control Data, and that was wonderful. And having a chance to practice on the mainframe was of course invaluable in getting that job. And in looking back, I'm not actually entirely sure how I wound up at Control Data because now looking back, I know how important it is to have things like degrees and qualifications and things like that, of which at least on paper I had very little. But we had the good fortune that around the time I was going to apply at Control Data, we decided we were going to focus just on the microcomputers. And so MECC decommissioned the mainframe and kicked all the users off of it. And there were several months where they had not gotten rid of the computer. They just got rid of all the users. And so we got a chance to play on it and patch things directly into core and experiment with all sorts of things like that. And so several of us turned out to go to Control Data afterwards, and we had a very different skill set than the other guys coming in, just because we'd had that direct experience on the mainframe. So we had, because of that really direct experience with the mainframe, that it was hard to duplicate unless you were us, or as you mentioned earlier, a typical paper boy with a cyber in his basement. That experience just wasn't available. And so several of us went on to be very successful at Control Data.
Nice. What do you do today?
Today, I'm glad you asked me that today. If you had asked me that 2 weeks ago, I would have had to say, well, I'm an unemployed burden on society. I have started up 2 software companies, and last year sold the second of them. But I've now founded a third one, and so we are 2 weeks in to the new venture, and so I'm working on cybersecurity, specifically solving the Ashley Madison problem. I don't know if you know Ashley Madison, in a data theft context, of course.
Sure.
But
that's like the company for screwing around and they got hacked, right?
Life is short, have an affair.
Right.
And some hackers came in and took their database and published it on the net. And it's a fairly well-known incident. And so we refer to our company as solving the Ashley Madison problem. And what we actually do is we prevent bulk data theft. And so if a nurse wants to bring up Prince's medical records and copy them down on a legal pad and sell it to someone, we can't prevent that, but we do prevent people from breaking into the hospital and stealing the entire medical database. So bulk data theft is our thing.
Nice. If you could send a message to the people who played your educational games back in the day, and you can right now, what would you tell them?
Well, as I mentioned before, really sorry about the dysentery, but they made us do that. That was not my idea. Let's see here. We worked hard to make them true to whatever we were doing. The Oregon experience, being a fish in Odell Lake, being a cell in the cell simulator, and so forth. We weren't, I guess, as concerned with realism in the math blasters thing. I don't know that Martians actually look like that. But I hope that we were able to make learning fun.
Excellent. Thank you.
My pleasure.
I think I have what I need. May your cells always have the correct ratio of sodium to water.
Thank you so much, and to you also.